Now it's on. Too much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're excited to have such a packed room, and it's going to be even more packed in the days to come. I'm Andrew Dalton. I'm the executive director of the Adams County Historical Society and the museum downstairs. Thank you. Well, we're just so excited to have this brand new, beautiful facility and to be here during the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg and looking off toward the battlefield. It's the perfect venue and the perfect place. And I think to start our evening series tonight, it's great to have my colleague Tim Smith. I probably should actually read his bio. We've known each other for so long, but I think because of the importance of the date tonight and the 160th, I will actually read your real bio. Timothy H. Smith is a licensed battlefield guide at the Gettysburg National Military Park, where he's been a guide for 25 years, more than 25 years. He's also the director of education at the Adams County Historical Society and was recently named the official Adams County historian. Yep. Which was a surprise, I should say. He did not know. We brought him in, and I think it was nice to see his reaction to that. He's a historical consultant regularly for the American Battlefield Trust, a frequent lecturer at Civil War roundtables and seminars around the region. He's appeared on Pennsylvania Cable Network's Battle Walk series, and his research has been featured in the Washington Post, National Geographic magazine, and many other publications over the years. And so Tim's program tonight, of course, is on the 160th anniversary of the topic. I also want to point out, just before I turn things over, a few of our events that we have in the next couple days. We have tomorrow morning, Jeff Sherrill will be signing books in our lobby from 10 to noon. And after that, we have a few lectures in the afternoon. I'm actually speaking at 1 p.m. about the fighting along Willoughby's Run. At 3 p.m., Tim and his colleague Eric Dorr from the Gettysburg Museum of History are talking about some of the artifacts that Eric's family has uncovered on the battlefield over the years. And then 7 p.m. tomorrow night, we have just a few tickets remaining, but it's a program called From Gettysburg to Normandy and Beyond, the next generation of history on YouTube. And that features a lot of the more popular YouTube hosts who've done videos around the world related to different history topics. J.D. Hewitt and the History Underground, Chris Mowry vlogging through history, and Gary Edelman and Chris White from the American Battlefield Trust. So they'll be on stage telling some really great stories tomorrow night. If you want to come out for that, there are still some tickets on our website. July 2nd, Tim's speaking on the Rocks of Gettysburg at 11 a.m. That's a free program open to the public. I think your favorite topic. And then at 1 p.m., we have the Life and Death of Jenny Wade with Cindy Small. That tomorrow, or Sunday evening, there's maybe only 10 tickets left to this now. The Rose Farm, A Photographic Mystery Solved with William A. Frasnito and Sue Boardman. Before that program, right at 7, we'll actually be unveiling a new Gettysburg photograph that was recently discovered and has never been seen before, taken in 1863. So that's on our website. July 3rd, unfortunately, our event with Stephen Lang is sold out. But on July 4th, we have a used book sale downstairs in our seminar room. And if you're around, I hope you'll come out. We have an incredible amount of used books that have been donated to us for this sale. It's really, really good stuff. In fact, today we just got a bunch of books from the personal library of Gabor Borit, the very famous Lincoln scholar. And so you can get a book that came from Gabor's library. So there's a lot of wonderful titles, that a lot of them out of print. So if you're here on July 4th, that's 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. during our regular open hours. And I think that about covers it. There was one other thing. On July 1st and 2nd from 1 to 4 p.m., West Point Museum is actually here, and they have a pop-up exhibit downstairs in that same room, our seminar room. And they have some really incredible artifacts related to the Battle of Gettysburg and different generals and soldiers that fought here. So if you have a chance to stop by and see that, that's open from 1 to 4 on both Saturday and Sunday, and free and totally open to the public. Hope you'll take a chance to see that. So we have a lot going on over the next few days, and if you're here for the weekend, I hope you'll take advantage of as many of the events that we have going as you can. But it's just wonderful to be here tonight with my good friend Tim Smith, who's going to give a program on June 30th, the eve or prelude to battle and the eve of battle.
Okay. Well, thanks for attending the program. I think the topic that I'm going to do tonight, I was trying to keep it just to the events that occurred on June 30th, but I have to start a couple days before to give an idea of what's going on. And I thought I'd highlight what was happening in Adams County during the prelude to battle. So you probably know, and we discussed it in a program we gave earlier this week, that on June 15th, the Southern Army reached Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And for about 2 weeks, the Southern Army was in south central Pennsylvania, marching back and forth across the middle of the state, gathering supplies and provisions, and wreaking havoc on the Pennsylvania countryside. And all there was to stop them was some local militia that were pretty ineffective. From June 26th to June 28th, the Southern Army marched across Adams and York County. Juba Early marched all the way to captured York, and only the burning of the Wrightsville Bridge kept his men from crossing the Susquehanna. In the meantime, other forces of Ewell's Second Army Corps, including Robert Rhodes and Edward Johnson, marched on Carlisle, and there was skirmishing outside of Harrisburg. Now, that sort of ended on June 28th, so I'm going to start on June 29th. I guess I threw this in here because it's so extraordinary, but this is an Adams County photographer, a guy named Charles Hymes of New Oxford, who happened to be traveling back from Lancaster County. His hobby was photography, and he happened to stop at the Wrightsville Bridge on June 5th, 1863, and record the only known image of the Wrightsville Bridge, since it was burned to the ground, or burned to the sea level, burned to the piers on the June 28th. Now, of course, June 28th, while the bridge was on fire and the Southern invasion was at its zenith, General Lee at Chambersburg was receiving word that the Federal Army was near Frederick, Maryland, and marching northward to catch up with them. So then Lee, of course, decided to order for the concentration of his army. On June 28th, there's, and I'll continue to show a map of Adams County with some marks on it as to the actions that are occurring in the county. We actually, on June 28th, had a skirmish in southwestern Adams County at a place called Fountaindale. And basically, the Confederate Third Army Corps, A.P. Hill, was in the Cumberland Valley on the other side of the South Mountain Range in Franklin County. And a group of artillerymen needed horses. They needed to gather up horses to pull the artillery. And they couldn't use any old horses, and a lot of horses broke down because the artillery was a little bit heavier than, just pulling a wagon. And they need teams of horses. So about 20 artillerymen actually raided over the mountains into Adams County. They came by way of Cold Springs Road into what today is Tract Road. I think when I was doing the program on June 26th, I was talking about the events of June 21st, where there was a battle at Monterey. And I think I mentioned Mount Hope Road, which is actually down here a little bit farther. I believe they came in Cold Springs Road on that day also. And if anybody's ever ridden over the mountain into Franklin County along Cold Springs Road, the road is really fascinating. It's really windy. It's still there. There was a hotel on the mountain called the Cold Springs Hotel that burned in a fire, I think, in about 1860. But it's a fascinating road. So the Southern Army came over the mountain, about 20 artillerymen gathering up horses. They actually stopped in Fairfield and robbed. It was a Sunday, and they stole all the horses from a church service where the people were attending church. They just kind of went and stole their horses. And the plan was to gather up more horses. They rode out through Fairfield. It appears if they rode along Jack's Mountain Road, and the plan was to ride over, the old 16 and back over into the Waynesboro area. Unbeknownst to them, a detachment of Company C, 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade, which had been stationed south of Frederick, Maryland, was sent at the urging of General Hooker into this area to obtain intelligence on the Confederate Army. And they came across the mountain on Harbaugh Valley Road and rode into Fountaindale just as this detachment of 20 Southern artillerymen with their stolen horses rode into Fountaindale, and there was a skirmish there. It was a very sudden skirmish. I don't believe anybody was killed in the skirmish. Nobody was killed. I don't think a couple of Confederates are slightly wounded. They captured about 20 Southern, I forget how many they captured, but they captured a number of the Southern soldiers and captured about 20 horses back, and they took them to Emmitsburg, Maryland. And I actually had written a whole article about the skirmish at Fountaindale that appears in one of the Blue and Gray magazines years ago. Another event that occurred on June 28th in our county, there's a map from Blue and Gray magazine that shows the route of the Southern mission or reconnaissance to gather horses and the route of Company C that was in Blue and Gray magazine. But another event that occurred there was a reconnaissance by the Army of the Potomac itself. You might hear in general books on the battle that General Buford and his Union cavalrymen were the first unit to arrive in Gettysburg on June 30th as the vanguard of the advance of the Army of the Potomac. But that's actually not true. There was a brigade of cavalry under the command of Joseph Copeland. It was the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. And actually, he only had 2 regiments with him here in this mission, and that was the 5th and the 6th Michigan Cavalry. And they rode up. They had been camped south of Emmitsburg ahead of the Army of the Potomac's advance, and they rode into the town on June 28th and spent the night in the fields east of the town. Again, it seems like they spent the night at the same place where the 10th New York Cavalry had their barracks for many months in 1861, 1862, the same spot where General Gordon's brigade camped on June 26, the same spot that would later be Camp Letterman General Hospital, the Wolf Farm, just east of the town. I guess it was a big open field and made a great camping site just outside of the town. We have several accounts by the civilians of this. J.H. Kidd of the Michigan Cavalry mentioned that on the morning of Sunday, June 28th, 2 regiments of Union Cavalry broke camp just south of Emmitsburg and set out towards Pennsylvania line. Their mission was, if possible, to find out what Lee and Longstreet, Ewell, and Stuart were doing on that holy day. According to Kidd, when they rode into town, it was a gala. The people were out in force and in their Sunday attire to welcome the troopers in blue. The church bell rang out a joyous peal, and dense masses of beaming faces filled the streets as a narrow column of 4s threaded its way in their midst. Lines of men stood on either side with pails of water and apple butter and passed a sandwich to each soldier as he passed. At intervals of a few feet were bevies of women and girls who handed up bouquets and wreaths of flowers. By the time the center of the town was reached, every man had a bunch of flowers in his hand and a wreath around his neck. Some even had their horses decorated, and one who did not get a share was a very modest trooper. It was about 10 o'clock, apparently, according to Sarah Broadhead, when the long line passed through town. She thought it would never end. I hope they may catch the rebels and give them a sound thrashing. I like that. Michael Jacobs, in his account, mentioned 2 regiments of Federal cavalry numbering about 2,000, probably about 1,000, under the command of General Copeland, entered our village from the direction of Emmitsburg. Amidst the rejoicing of the people, and we distributed bread and pies amongst them, while some of the youths sang patriotic songs. They encamped east of the town until the next morning, when they left and moved towards Littlestown. Joseph Copeland himself actually spent a night at the city hotel on the square, according to one account, which I assume they mean the McClellan House. And while he was here, he spoke to David McConaughey, who gave him a report about the whereabouts of the Southern Army and what the condition of their army was when they passed through town 2 days earlier. Now, Joseph Copeland, there's David McConaughey. Of course, David McConaughey, if you remember in our program, you people who watched it earlier this week, he was the leader of an independent group of scouts that were older men and younger boys that were gathering information about the Southern Army during their invasion. Now, on June 29th, Copeland's force returns by 2 different routes to Emmitsburg, Maryland. And just south of Emmitsburg, Copeland would run into the head of the 1st Army Corps marching up from Frederick towards Emmitsburg, and he would be given a message that he was relieved of duty. And of course, George Armstrong Custer would be named the commander of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade that Joseph Copeland was in charge of. And that's the number one reason that you never hear about Copeland's mission to Gettysburg and his reconnaissance. Also, Copeland was sent on this mission by Joseph Hooker. And of course, then Meade's in command when he's heading back. Now, on June 29th, we have a few interesting events that occur. One of them is it's June 29th that Henry Heath's division arrives in Cashtown. And when Henry Heath's division arrives there, a detachment of Heath's division, we believe 2 regiments. We know that the 42nd Mississippi is one of them. Perhaps the 52nd Mississippi is a part of that regiment is the other unit that's sent there with a battery of artillery is sent to Fairfield. And they get to Fairfield, and according to their accounts, there is a skirmish there. And although they don't really say who that skirmish is with, it seems likely that that skirmish is with one of Copeland's regiments, either the 5th or the 6th, I don't know which one took which road, that bumps into this detachment. Or quite possibly, they could be referring to a skirmish with scouts of Buford's command, but that's something I'm not really sure about. So here's in an early local magazine that highlighted photographs from our area. Here is looking towards Cashtown. We're right near the edge of the town. Of course, this is a rock top right above the Cashtown Inn. And we're looking towards the town from the east, looking west. And it mentions in this account that, of course, Heath's guys arrived there on June 29th. Now, again, Copeland leaves Gettysburg on that day, and by 2 different routes, his men ride to Emmitsburg. We also have, on June 29th, in the evening, the arrival in Littlestown of Judson Kilpatrick's division. And one of the things I'm interested in when I read about these units is their response to first crossing the line into Pennsylvania, especially the regiments that are from Pennsylvania, passing into their home state for the first time. And you see it throughout the army as they're marching northward. Here's an interesting account. I'll read you the account first. On our advance into the Keystone State at a late hour last night, the boys were almost frantic with joy, and they made the welcome ring with cheers as soon as the state line was crossed. The head of the column reached Littlestown, Pennsylvania at 11 o'clock, being the first of the Union troops that had marched from Virginia to protect the keystone of the arch from being broken by rebel hands. The hotels, stores, and private dwelling houses were brilliant with flashing lights, and cheers were given for the deliverers of Pennsylvania, more than 3 times 3. The ladies of the village baked bread for the soldiers during the whole night, not once closing their eyes in sleep. And the excitement of seeing for the first time even the advance column of an army kept them awake in the morning. They arrived, according to different accounts, between 10 and 11 o'clock. And they went into bivouac a few miles out of Littlestown on the road to Hanover. According to a diary of Charles H. Blenn, I think he's in the 1st Vermont Cavalry, about 50 young ladies had assembled at the Union Hotel as we entered the place. Sweet singing greeted our ears and made glad our hearts. The red, white, and blue, the Star-Spangled Banner, etc., were sung with the greatest enthusiasm, the chorus being joined in by hundreds of weary soldiers. May the fair ladies and good people of Littlestown long live in peace, prosperity, and happiness. And I should have mentioned, the first account I read was from the Philadelphia Inquirer, printed on July 4th, 1863. It was written by a correspondent of the Philadelphia Inquirer riding in the column with Kilpatrick's men. There was a guy in the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry who wrote that his command was halted in front of a hotel where a number of young ladies sang patriotic songs. On returning to Littlestown in 1910, he was introduced to one of the girls who sang to him that night and gave the boys in blue great pleasure. Her name was Mrs. Charlescom, and her actual maiden name was Julia Barker. In the history of Littlestown, there is this portrait of the Barker family. And her father, Joseph Barker, was the owner of what was then known as the Union Hotel, or sometimes you see it referred to as the Barker House. And just for your knowledge, it's on northwest side, northwest corner of the square of Littlestown. And, you know, I don't think that building is the same building that stood then. If it is, it's been greatly altered. It's shown on the 1858 wall map and several other sources. Also, there are several sources that indicate that Barker Hotel was the headquarters of Justin Kilpatrick on the evening of June 29th. And according to the family, early in the morning hours, General George Armstrong Custer arrives there at that hotel to meet with Kilpatrick and take command of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. And of course, many of his men don't know he's in command of them until the next day when they're in the midst of the Battle of Hanover. You probably have heard. Joseph Barker had a large family. And like I said, his daughters were among those who sang to the soldiers as they entered town. A strong Union man, his oldest son had served as an officer on General William B. Franklin's staff and was killed in the fighting at Sharpsburg on September 17th, 1862. According to Pennsylvania Gettysburg, I think it's in the, off the top of my head, in the 18th Pennsylvania section, we shall all ever remember the enthusiasm of the loyal men and women of this little Pennsylvania town. and how with patriotic songs and cheers they entertained us and fed us as we halted in the main street of the village. To such scene inspired devotion and intensely patriotic fervor. The Confederates had been long accustomed to this, for their march and camp and battle had before that been on their own soil in the midst of their own sympathetic friends. But, this person is making the point that this is something that the Union Army is not used to. Of course, one interesting thing about Kilpatrick arriving in Littlestown on June 29th, unbeknownst to him or any of the men in his command, is that the Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry are camped just 6 miles south at Union Mills that same night. According to Sallie Myers' diary for the evening of June 29th, their campfires can be seen in the mountains. Our men in great numbers are advancing from Frederick, and we may expect a battle both near and soon. God help us, for surely our cause is one of justice and humanity. And I wanted to mention one other thing that happens on June 29th, and that's that in Gettysburg, they were very anxious all day. And Alice Powers mentioned that we waited in dread. In the evening, Mr. Samuel Herbst, on a swift horse, started out for Emmitsburg Road to secure, if possible, some information on the Army of the Potomac. He came back late at night with comforting assurance that the road this side of Frederick was thronged with marching ranks of the boys in blue. The news flew through the town like wildfire. And I don't think a lot of people have picked up on this. The people in Gettysburg know that Union soldiers are going to be marching into the town the next day, and they anticipate it. So again, on June 29th, one more thing we should talk about, and that's the fact that General John Buford's division arrives at Monterey and Fountaindale. And basically, General Buford's command had been in Middletown in Maryland. And on June 29th, they marched west over the mountains into Washington County, and they came up through Smithsburg, and they came up through Rouserville, and they went up, well, of course, then it was called Waterloo. And they went up and over the South Mountain Range, and they camped for the night at Monterey and Fountaindale on the old, Waynesboro, Emmitsburg Road. According to the 3rd West Virginia Cavalry and Devon's Brigade, they camped near Montgomery Springs. And the history of the 6th New York refers to the area as Mallory Springs. Presumably, both are referring to Monterey Springs. Several sources, including General Buford's official report, mention they camped near Fairfield or Millerstown, which is actually on the, Fairfield's actually on the other side of the mountain from where they are. But there is a gap in the mountain, and at that time, there were not as many trees, and you had a much clearer view, as we'll see in a moment. According to Pennsylvania Gettysburg, the day's march had a significance, however, far beyond the comprehension of the toiling officer and soldier of the line. The trained eye and splendid forecast of General Buford scanned with eager interest the landscape that opened to his view on this mountain highway. Gravely impressed by the importance of impending events, Buford said to the officers surrounding him, "Within 48 hours, the concentration of both armies will take place upon some field within view, and a great battle will be fought." And what's he talking about? This is a postcard from the porch of the Monterey House. And we're looking through the Monterey Gap into Adams County. And imagine that's the mountain where Ski Liberty is. Musselman's Knob, sometimes it's referred to. Whoop, I thought I had another picture in there. What did I do with that? There it is. So there is from our collection, a pamphlet advertising the Monterey House from 1869. And it's just really fascinating. So theoretically, that photograph looking through the Monterey Pass towards Adams County is taken from, the hotel. And again, you see it. This is from a postcard. So on June 30th, some interesting events occur. And a couple things. According to Theodore Bean, one thing I should mention, the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry, Company G, is from Waynesboro. And they are camped, right near Waynesboro. And that night, the company is given permission to go home and visit their families. And of course, just like Company K after the Battle of Gettysburg goes home to visit their families, in regimental history, every single man returns exactly when they're supposed to. So, and Theodore Bean, who writes the regimental history, he mentions, from the highest point reached in passing over the mountain road in the direction of Emmitsburg, one of the grandest landscape views of the state is seen, overlooking the broad and beautiful Cumberland Valley. So, now at that location, as I mentioned, the night before, Confederate forces had, at least 2 regiments, had marched to Fairfield. And according to the record of events for the 42nd Mississippi, on the morning of the 29th, that regiment was detached to feel the enemy's cavalry. Proceeding in the direction of Fairfield, a considerable skirmish ensued. The enemy was driven from town. After nightfall, they charged our pickets but were repulsed. None of Buford's accounts in any of the units mention a skirmish with the Confederates on the 29th. So we believe it's got to be Copeland as he's marching out of Gettysburg back to Emmitsburg. Company B of the 52nd North Carolina, they wrote, on the evening of the 29th, were detailed to picket the Emmitsburg Road at a village called Millerstown. Millerstown is just another term for Fairfield because it was founded by John Miller and his son William Miller. About 5 miles to the right of our camp, and during the night had a skirmish with a picket post held by the enemy's cavalry. During the night of the 30th, the company was withdrawn and reported back to camp. Very interesting part of this story is that Beaufort denies that he knows of this presence of this Confederate force near Fairfield. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, Beaufort, in his dispatch, that's the next day. Where did I put that? Oh, in 1867, John Watts de Peyster suggested another explanation of Beaufort's activities. He says in his book, which apparently is based on the recollections of David McConaughey, who was reporting to him at that time. And of course, McConaughey spoke to General Beaufort on June 30th. He wrote that, seeing the rebel campfires in the valley below, Beaufort got his men in the saddle early a.m. in order to surprise the rebel detachment at Fairfield. Now, according to Beaufort on the 30th, and this is a message that he sent headquarters, I could not find anyone in Maryland that knew the places I was ordered to march through. I went to Boonesboro, thence to Cavetown, Monterey, and encamped 2 miles south of Millersburg. That morning at 4:30, this morning at 4:30 a.m., I found at Millersburg, I found 2 regiments of Mississippi infantry, 1,400 strong. I drove their pickets to camp, but being out of position assigned me and fearing I might interfere with other plans, I did not attack them, but ordered my men to get back in their proper place. And when you read the regimental histories and all the accounts that we have of it, it's clear that Buford's orders are to march to Emmitsburg and then to Gettysburg. But Buford, for some reason, instead of doing that, breaks his detachment at half, sends the 6th New York over Iron Springs Road by way of Monterey, and he actually sends the 8th Illinois and some other men by Jack's Mountain Road. It appears that he's trying to attack the Confederate force at Fairfield that he claims he knows nothing about. I'd imagine Beaufort apologists, which I am not, will insist that he just notices on the map that the road through Fairfield would take you to Gettysburg a little bit quicker, and that's why he's on that road, instead of detouring down to Emmitsburg and then back up. What's really fascinating is Abner Doubleday mentions that on the evening of June 29th, upon arriving at Emmitsburg, they bivouacked for the night on a height north of the town. The position had been carefully selected by General Reynolds, as the rebels had been reported in some strength in Fairfield. So although Buford apparently doesn't get word that there's a strong force of Confederates in Fairfield, somehow probably a citizen of Fairfield rode to Emmitsburg, which is not far south of there, and let the Union Army, the First Corps, know. Or perhaps if there was a skirmish between, on the 29th, between the Michigan Cavalry under Copeland, they told Reynolds that they got in a skirmish with some of those soldiers when they met Reynolds at on the advance. That's probably what I'd suggest. This whole thing that occurs at Fairfield is somewhat embarrassing for General Buford and a debacle. Because, I think, and how can I say this without being too insulting? I think they're expecting to meet other cavalry, and they meet infantry, and they're repulsed very quickly. Cavalry are not going to make a dent in an infantry line. It just doesn't happen. But Buford places the blame for all this squarely on the people of Adams County, which again, he's not making me his friend. This is according to his official report. The inhabitants knew of my arrival and the position of the enemy's camp, yet not one of them gave me a particle of information, not even mentioned the fact of the enemy's presence. The whole community seemed stampeded and afraid to speak or act, often offering as excuses for not showing some little enterprise, "The rebels will destroy our homes if we tell you anything." That's in quotes. Had any one of them give me timely information and acted as guide that night, I could have surprised and captured or destroyed this whole force. You're right. And I'd imagine to attack and capture a force, you might have to suffer casualties, which cavalrymen are not going to do. So I don't know why this angers me so much. So obviously the people in Fairfield who are on the other side of the mountain don't know that Buford arrived at Monterey or Fountaindale. He came over the other side of the mountain. He's on top of the other side of the mountain, And the people in Fountaindale, they're in the same position that Buford's in. They don't know the Confederates are down there in the valley, if he doesn't. So I just find it very interesting, this whole episode. Now, Kilpatrick. Okay, let's go to a different subject. This is going to be a series of my thoughts on these different things that happen, I can tell. So, In the early morning hours of June 30th, Judson Kilpatrick's division heads out on the road towards Hanover. In Hanover, they ride through the center of the town where they receive just a joyous reception again from Hanover. Wow, this is great. They love it. I mean, like when I was just talking about Littlestown, how many people have ever heard someone say something nice about Littlestown? I think it's great. So they get to Hanover. Hanover treats them really well. They ride through the town. They go onto the road, the old Monocacy Road that goes up through Abbottstown. And they come back into Adams County, and they reach the square of Abbottstown. And apparently at this point, Kilpatrick's division was pretty spread out, regiment by regiment in long rows of four. And they're spread out from just near Littlestown all the way to Abbottstown. And two things interesting about this. Let's see this. Yeah, here it is. At Abbottstown, Henry Cobbler was a proprietor of the American Hotel located on the northeast quadrant of the square. His 15-year-old daughter was Patience Cobbler. She lived into her 90s. And years later, she recalled the incident of the Civil War days. And according to Patience, Kilpatrick stopped at her father's hotel. And she remembered seeing George Armstrong Custer when he came there from Hanover to consult with Kilpatrick. Now, this is probably, though, after the, Kilpatrick might be there before the Battle of Hanover, but this is after the Battle of Hanover when Custer could have been there. I should mention, has anybody ridden on 194, the road from Hanover up to Abbottstown? When you go over the Pigeon Hills, it goes over a steep hill and it's pretty windy there. Well, when he got to a stream bed in the low point in between Abbottstown and Hanover, there was a serious accident. A caisson of Battery M, 2nd United States Artillery, exploded, tearing off the leg of the driver. And his, let's see, I have his name here somewhere. I think it's James Moran. I'm sure that sounds right. It's been a while since I talked about it. And he actually dies and is taken first to Abbottstown, buried in a Lutheran seminary there, or cemetery there, and then his body's taken up to Paradise Protectorate, if you know where that is. It's a Catholic church and cemetery just north of Abbottstown, technically in York County, Pennsylvania. And I've been to visit his stone. He was actually a guy in one of the Michigan Cavalry units that had been detached and was on service with the artillery battery that was attached to that division. So it's just fascinating. And you can visit this guy's grave in the cemetery. Unfortunately, the state of Pennsylvania got him mixed up with another person of the same name who died during the war, and they have him listed as a soldier, I think like in the 54th Pennsylvania or something like that. But in point of fact, he's with the Michigan, with this artillery unit attached to the Michigan Cavalry. Also, now you probably know this, I'm not going to get into the specific battle of Hanover, but as Kilpatrick's division is passing through Hanover, Jeb Stuart's men are at Union Mills, and they come up the old Westminster Road, and Jeb Stuart crashes into the rear of Kilpatrick's division. Kilpatrick turns around his men and heads back to Hanover, and of course this whole thing explodes into this massive cavalry battle in the streets of Hanover and in the fields south and southeast of it. At the same time, detachments under squads of men from Jeb Stuart are crossing over into Adams County on various roads, and there is a skirmish at a place called Jeremiah Gitt's Mill. According to Robert Spangler, who was born in that area in 1867, Here, on the morning of June 30th, 1863, two parties of scouts from Lee's Confederate Army and Kilpatrick's Union Army met. A fight ensued. Most of the windows were shot out of the mill. A Confederate soldier was killed and buried nearby, but was later removed to his home in the southern states. So there's actually a Confederate killed in that battle there near Gitz Mill, which is on a road just south of 194 between Littlestown and Hanover. I used to, let's see, I had the soldier's name here. I don't think I have it written down on this piece of paper, though. I think Jim Klaus and Ed Guy are just amazing at finding the identities of these people that were killed in these skirmishes all around these areas. Of course, you might know that there's a little book written on this, the fighting outside of the Battle of Hanover that you can read about that talks about this incident too. Now, what's really fascinating for me, though, the point I want to make, I should say that's John Krepp's book, in case you're interested in that book. But the interesting thing about this is there's some skirmishes all along this area between Littlestown and Hanover that morning. Let's see, do I have one of those accounts? I thought I put one of those accounts in there. Oh, yeah. According to one of the Michigan cavalrymen, when news of Fitzhugh Lee's appearance, the Confederate cavalry there, to horse was sounded, and Colonel Gray led the 6th Michigan on the Hanover Road towards the point indicated. Several citizens with shotguns in their hands were seen going on foot on flanks of the column, trying to keep pace with the cavalry and apparently eager to participate in the expected battle. So you don't hear much about civilians being involved in these actions. And later someone refers to this as the John Burns event of Littlestown, where these guys are trying to get involved in the fight. But there is actually mention in one of the Michigan Cavalry's accounts that there's a skirmish on the Baltimore Pike south of Littlestown. I don't know how convinced I am of this fact, but I think the idea is the Southerners, as they're marching through this area, encounter squads of Northerners on these various roads that lead in and out of the area. And there could be several really small gunfights or skirmishes. But the point is that the 12th Army Corps had started early on the morning of June 30th, and they are coming up from Frederick, Maryland, through Taneytown into the area of Littlestown on the Monocacy Road, or what is now 194. And when they get close to Littlestown, they're told about the skirmish. According to the official report by General Alpheus Williams, the enemy's cavalry with artillery were approaching that place. Confederate infantry was also believed to be in the vicinity, and firing was heard at some distance beyond the town. And I think it's safe to say that the 12th Army Corps under Henry Warner Slocum overreacts to this small skirmish along the Hanover-Littlestown Road. They apparently get word that the Southerners are moving on force in Littlestown, and the 12th Corps rushes through Littlestown on the double quick. Later, many of the soldiers will regret this, because the citizens of Littlestown are standing there with cakes and pies and water. And they're double quicking through the town and not taking advantage of their hospitality. And part of the 12th Army Corps actually goes into line of battle on the east side of Littlestown and starts pushing skirmishers out and marching out to join in this combat. Now, granted, they're just going to spend the night there at that location. So they don't really get a chance to understand how far the actual fighting in Hanover is from them. And they, in their later accounts, believe that they're just on the edge of the Hanover battlefield. And it's actually much farther away. And what they were reacting to was just some small skirmishing along this route. But I have to say this, the overreaction of General Slocum and his commanders to this action that occurred on, a few miles in front of them, which, turns out to be a cavalry affair. This might influence General Slocum's decision the next day. On July 1st, Slocum, they'll turn around and march up the Baltimore Pike and camp at 2 taverns. And of course, everybody says, you're only a few miles from Gettysburg. The 12th Army Corps could have been involved in the first day of the battle had they moved forward in a timely fashion, but they don't, for 2 reasons. One, because General Reynolds is in charge of a wing of the Army that includes the 1st Army Corps, the 3rd Army Corps, and the 11th Army Corps, and Slocum is in charge of the 12th Army Corps, the wing that they're involved in with the 5th Army Corps, and they're not in the same command structure. So the orders would have to go a different way to get to Slocum to order him there. And of course, there's a Pipe Creek Circular on July 1st that ordered him to move to 2 taverns. Now, should Slocum have showed some enthusiasm or some gumption and got himself moving towards the battle? Maybe. But what's he know about the Battle of Gettysburg? It's just another affair of cavalry out there, and his men totally overreacted the night before to the same thing at Hanover. So, and then, of course, the death of Reynolds, and Reynolds not sending, he dies and doesn't send a message to Slocum. So, all these things, build up. But I just think the things that happen on June 30th have a lot to do why Slocum doesn't move to Gettysburg on July 1st. Okay, that's just another one of my opinions. So there's the 12th Army Corps moving into position, and they camp at Littlestown for the night. And then, of course, we have Pettigrew's expedition. So, according to Aaron Shilley, we'll let him tell the story, local historian in 1900, General Pettigrew of Hill's Corps with his brigade comprised several thousand men advanced to the town of Gettysburg to secure a supply of shoes reported to be at McConaughey's store on the center square. Wow. He is really specific, isn't he? Not just a shoe factory. He's got the exact name of the store. And McConaughey, Robert McConaughey, who actually was wounded in the fighting, is one of the civilians that's wounded, actually had a little shoe store in the corner of the square in the Wills building, which is fascinating. And he's got a claims file too. He doesn't have much of a store though. I don't know how many shoes are going to get from him. It's not a very big store, not a shoe factory. But Pettigrew's brigade advances towards Gettysburg on June 30th on a mission to reconnoiter the town. And he's given specific orders that he's not to bring on any kind of general battle or engagement. And so Pettigrew advances towards the town. He's got a couple thousand men. And when he gets to the top of Seminary Ridge and views the town, he is warned, according to several accounts, by a local citizen, or he's just warned by, you could take it, some of his scouts, but he learns that General Buford's command is on the Emmitsburg Road traveling towards Gettysburg. So he decides at that point to turn around and go back to Cashtown. And then, of course, General Buford's command rides into the town. I got to tell you, when I was first reading about this, I think when I was younger, and there are several articles and or books out there that make it appear as if Buford's cavalry division drives Pettigrew's men back. And a couple of people who have written about it suggest that there's some actual fighting between the advanced elements of Buford's cavalry and Pettigrew's brigade, and they capture prisoners. But it's clear from reading all the accounts that Pettigrew's men retreat prior to Beaufort arriving in the town. And when Beaufort does arrive in the town, he does send a detachment out the Chambersburg Pike towards Pettigrew, but they stop at a safe distance and just kind of watch them retreat back across Marsh Creek towards Cashtown, and there's no interaction between the two forces. So I just think that some people have exaggerated how much pushing Beaufort does, or how much, underestimate how much retreating the Confederate Army undertake. So Beaufort and about 3,000 Northern cavalrymen arrive in the town of Gettysburg about 11 a.m., 11:30 on June 30th, 1863. I think, and not to pick on any particular artist, I think this is more Kunstler, but they come up Washington Street in the town. I don't think Beaufort was ever on Baltimore Street at any time. But here he's going past the Adams County Courthouse, which apparently sits out by itself, not in the town at all. But I just like the look of it, where Beaufort's men are come riding into town, and there's no civilians out at all. But really, it's more like this. General Beaufort's command comes up the Emmitsburg Road, turns onto Washington Street, right at Tommy's Pizza, and comes just riding through the town. And this is McClellan entering Frederick, Maryland in 1862. And this is how I view it. According to, let's see, what's his name? Captain William Hazelton, who's in the 8th Illinois Cavalry. When our cavalry advanced, reached the city, and passed on through its streets, men, women, and children crowded the sidewalks and vied with each other in demonstrations of joyous welcome. Hands were reached up eagerly to clasp the hands of our bronzed and dusty troopers. Cake, beer, milk, and wine were passed up to the moving column as we marched slowly along the crowded streets. Doors and windows and balconies were filled with ladies, waving their handkerchiefs, bright eyes and smiling faces looking down from the open windows upon the troopers, with now and then a matron trying to smile through her fast-falling tears as she remembers her own boy in the army. Although it was one of the most touching, altogether, it was one of the most touching, spontaneous, and heartfelt demonstrations my eyes ever witnessed. Here's a view. We showed this earlier today, and Abby, when Abby did her program on children of the battlefield with Sue, and this is a colorized version of this view. We just colorized it, but this is an 1858 class at the Methodist Sunday School. So it's 1858. So these girls would have been in town at the time of the battle. This is Sallie Myers, later Sallie Myers Stewart. And this is Julia Culp, Wesley Culp's sister, in this view. So it gives you an idea what some of the girls look like. Sallie Myers writes a lot about this. Along the street we stood, all the girls and women of the town. We had prepared food in advance. Again, they learned the night before that the Union Army is close and we're going to arrive the next day. What's really fascinating about that is they think it's going to be the Union infantry, because the guy, Samuel Herbst, is talking to like the 1st Army Corps, not Beaufort's cavalry. So this is a surprise to them. We had baskets and trays in our hands. They came by, snatching in their hasty passage whatever they could lay their hands on. Sandwiches, pieces of pie, cold meat, bread, cakes, cups, and coffee and bottles of water. And then we sang patriotic songs. Of course, I'm sure many of you have heard Tilly Pierce writes about this event in the book where the girls start singing. A crowd of us girls were standing on the corner of Washington and High Street as the soldiers passed by, desiring to encourage them who, as we were told, would before long be in battle. my sister started to sing the old war song, Our Union Forever. As some of us did not know the whole of the piece, we kept repeating the chorus. Thus, we sought to cheer our brave boys, and we felt amply repaid when we saw that our efforts were appreciated. Their countenances brightened, and we received their thanks and cheers. After the battle, some of these soldiers told us that the singing was very good, but they would have liked to have heard more than the chorus. I like that she makes a joke there. And there's lots of really nice accounts of this event in our town. But basically, all the girls that were gathered there started singing patriotic songs, and it caught on. And at every street corner, at Breckenridge Street and Washington Street and Middle Street and High Street, girls sang to the soldiers. In 1903, there was a 40th anniversary celebration of the battle. And one of the soldiers in the 6th New York Cavalry got the idea to gather up as many as the girls he could find and have them come to the center of the square where they had built a platform. He found 16 of them. And they came to the center of the square, and they got up on the platform, and they sang the same patriotic songs over again for the veterans that they sang for the soldiers that day. And this event made big news, and it's reported in a lot of newspapers, and the girls became known as the Singing Girls. And year after year, during the anniversary of the battle, people would insist that the Singing Girls to get together and perform a concert. And so they sort of became a yearly activity at the anniversary of the battle. And here's a 1910 image of the Singing Girls. So here's one half of them, and there's the other half. I do recognize a few of the women. Like this is clearly Sallie Myers, and that's clearly Alice Powers. I don't have the names of the other girls in the image here, but this is from a newspaper article that I discovered online. And if you just, what I do is I just go into newspaper search engines and put things like Singing Girls, Battle of Gettysburg, and you come up with articles about these things. In 1913, they got together once again, and at this point, there were only 6 of them that they could find that still lived in Gettysburg that were still alive, although many others lived later. And 2 of them, Sallie Myers Stewart and Amanda Renneker Rupp, she lived at the time of the battle with her aunt, Nancy Weichert, on the first block of Chambersburg Street. And she would marry one of the Rupps, I guess John Rupp's brother, William, if I remember correctly is his name. But they were invited for the June 30th, 1863 celebration at the big tent of the 1913 reunion, the same tent a few days later that Woodrow Wilson would give a speech in. It held thousands of people. And here's, I don't think this is them, but here's just an illustration of the tent. And if you've ever seen in photographs, this thing sits in the middle of the fields of Pickett's Charge, the veterans tent. And they sang patriotic songs, and there are accounts of it. And to summarize the Singing Girls, Captain Hazelton of the 8th Illinois summed up the feelings that many of Buford's men had of this. To receive such a reception under such circumstances as we did was an inspiration. It awoke every feeling of chivalry in our souls. It recalled to memory all the dear and loved ones we had left at home. It brought back with overwhelming force the love of country which had first impelled us to enlist. It inspired us to heroic deeds. One of Buford's cavalrymen saw a little girl, Emma Yount, sitting near the Washington House Hotel, the current site of Lincoln Diner, and stopped and talked to her. And he said that she reminded him of her child back home. So he ended up giving her a scarf with George Washington on it, and she saved it. And of course, that's on display in our museum. General Beaufort made his headquarters at the Eagle Hotel. And that night, I think it's interesting, one of the first things he did was to place his headquarters in the bar of the hotel so that no one would dare come into it. And he had an order printed that was hung all around town. And some of you I know have been in the Farnsworth House, and you might know that Loring years ago got a copy from an original of the order that was hung around town and has it there in the tavern. The sale of spirituous liquors of any kind in this town during its occupation by the troops is strictly prohibited. Any violation of this order will promptly and severely be punished. The giving away of alcohol will be punished the same as if by sale, by order of Brigadier General Beaufort. And so he has it hung all around town. A guy named Frank Eaton, the adjutant of the 6th New York, claimed that he was the one ordered by General Beaufort, quote, to go around and close all the saloons. He performed his duty, but admitted that he didn't close the bar in the Eagle Hotel until he had sent a case of liquor to his room, where he retired shortly after. Now, what's really interesting is I found this article about Frank Eaton, who's on Beaufort's staff. He comes back for the 1913 reunion, the 50th anniversary of the battle, and stays at the Eagle Hotel in the same room he stayed the night before the battle. I think that's awesome. So we have lots of accounts of Beaufort being in town. And of course, while he's in town that night, he gathers up information, sends couriers off to General Reynolds and General Meade. And General Meade sends a courier to the Eagle Hotel. And there's a lot of discussion about what the plan should be. Unfortunately for us, General Beaufort dies in 1863. John Fulton Reynolds is killed at the battle. And those two, since we don't have their personal recollections of the events that occurred the night before the battle, and during the day we just have what other people say they said, it's kind of given us a void. But, people have no problem telling you what they think, they thought, or what they did, or, things. But that's one of the issues we have about the battle. Henry Eyster Jacobs remembered that after Beaufort arrived, in a few minutes he had learned from the citizens all they knew concerning the movements of the enemy, secured 2 of the best horsemen among our townsmen as guide, and determined upon the disposition of his forces. Robert McLean watched the general dismount in front of the Ditterline residence on Chambersburg Street. Gary Owen. So next time you're Gary Owen, go ahead and sit on the steps and think about this. Beaufort had seated himself on the doorsteps and addressed a dispatch to General Reynolds conveying information which Mr. David McConaughey, the leader of our local scouts, was communicating verbally to him. With boyish curiosity and regardless of good manners, I looked over his shoulder as he wrote. So, in the movie Gettysburg, remember Beaufort sitting on a cot in front of the seminary building writing the message. But here, he's at Gary Owen sitting on the steps. Okay, so I want you to just make sure to reenact that at some point. According to Beaufort, and Beaufort sends several messages, so we don't know exactly what message this may be. And the messages are in the official reports. But the night of June 30th is a busy night for the division. According to him, no reliable information of value could be obtained from the inhabitants. Come on, he's talking to him. Read his report. He says that Anderson's division and Pender's division and Heath's division are at Cashtown. How does he know that? What kind of scout did he send over the Southerners to determine that Pender's back there behind Heath? Come on, he's getting it from these locals. But I love that. Okay. 2 more topics I want to talk about. Now, also on June 30th, Richard Ewell's forces start to congregate around Heidlersburg. Robert Rhodes' division on the morning of June 30th marches basically from Carlisle on Route 94, the Baltimore Pike, marches over the mountain into Adams County and goes to York Springs and turns and comes down the old Harrisburg Road, and they camp just north of today's Heidlersburg. Juba Early's forces leave York and march out and come across 234 through East Berlin, and they camp about 3 miles from Heidlersburg at the base of a prominence we refer to as Round Hill. And also, Albert Jenkins and some other assorted cavalrymen with the 2nd Army Corps come across Route 30 into Abbottstown, reach the area of New Oxford, and then turn and ride up through Newchester and head towards the main encampment where they'll all assemble on the night of June 30th. One thing I'd like to point out here is that when Albert Jenkins' command, I wonder if I put it in here, when Albert Jenkins' command comes into Abbottstown, they heard all this cannon fire just a few miles south of them at Hanover. And according to George Shower, who was with the detachment, we were startled and mystified by the sound of cannonading to the south of us, later ascertaining it to be a conflict between Brethard's guns and Federal artillery as Stuart and Kilpatrick encountered each other at Hanover, but 6 miles from us. Doesn't someone tell these guys to keep an eye out for Jeb Stuart? They pass each other. Don't they? They got to get some word to Jeb Stuart, don't you think? Okay. This article I'm talking about is in Confederate Veteran, and it's called Another If. Should they be getting word to them? But yeah, they do pass pretty close by each other when they come back through. Now, that night, of course, Early goes over to Ewell, and they have a meeting in Heidlersburg about the situation. And that's where they receive the report that, concentrate in the area of Gettysburg or Cashtown as circumstances might require. And Trimble writes a letter about this. Isaac Trimble, who was with them, and is very, he claims that he's the only one who really knows what Lee means. But I think Ewell does an incredible job at this meeting of deciding the next morning to start troops on the way to Middletown, which is now Biggerville, and also have Early come and start down the Harrisburg Road. And then eventually they'll turn this force around and head to Gettysburg on July 1st when they learn that Hill is moving troops towards Gettysburg, and it's going to be, 3 forces converging on the town from 3 different directions, which will really benefit the Southern Army on July 1st. Again, you probably know I'm a big fan of General Ewell and General Meade, of course, and not a big fan of cavalry in general, or Sickles. I just threw that in since, Jim Hesser probably would want like that. But it's fascinating when you read about these people. It's really difficult sometimes when you read about these historic figures not to form an opinion of their actions or their activities. But I'm definitely enamored by General Ewell's movements prior to the battle and during the battle. I don't pick on him. I don't pick on him about Culp Sale. So I wanted to mention this account. Samuel Hammers is 11 years old at the time, and he lives near Rock Chapel. His parents run a woolen mill. and just north of Heidlersburg. I think Abbey lives like right near where this guy lived. And according to his account, written much later, again, he's 11. Father and mother were at work at the factory. We took a walk to the Confederate camp, and all of a sudden we're in the midst of 40,000 soldiers. The camp had hundreds of dead carcasses of all kinds. And he goes into the camp and he's talking to the Confederates, and they ask him what they're doing, what these two little boys or him and his friend are doing in their camp, and they explain they live nearby. And finally, after a good time with the Southerners, one of the Southerners decides, hey, I'm going to take you home. You probably shouldn't be here. As we left the camp, we noticed some soldiers were throwing packs of nicely pictured cards away. We picked up a pack, and on the way home, we asked one of the escorts why the men threw away these nice cards. He replied, son, these are cards which bad men used to gamble with. When soldiers go into battle, they throw them away as they do not wish to be found dead with cards on their body. And then he goes on to say, when we reached our gate, these men said, goodbye, son. Never use cards when you grow up. And he talks about a bunch of stuff in the article, but this is how he ends it. This boy grew up, and now at the age of 80 years, we can truthfully say that we have never handled cards, never attempted to dance, and never attended a theater or movies. Yeah, you wouldn't want to do that. But there he is in this picture. He lived later, Samuel Hammers is his name, and this is the Marsh Creek Church of the Brethren on Her Tavern Road near Knoxland Road. And he had a store at Knoxland Mill. And I could tell you a bunch of stories about him. He's a very colorful, picturesque figure. I'll just mention one of them. You can look up in the newspapers if you like, online. He decides to have a mail order bride. So he places an advertisement in newspapers all across the country. And you go into a store and you've got a whole wall with letters of ladies who are vying to be his wife. He is very fascinating. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to talk about on June 30th was this, the First Army Corps arriving. Let's see. Now, the First Army Corps was at Emmitsburg on the morning of June 30th. And they got up leisurely, I guess about 9 a.m. They started marching, and they marched 5 miles. And they went into camp around Marsh Creek, and we'll talk about their camp in a moment. My point is that a lot of times when people talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, they portray it as if the armies are in a race to see who can get there first. And, this is portrayed, obviously, in the movie Gettysburg, where, we're going to try to hold out as long as possible tomorrow morning. And, boy, I hope the First Corps can make it here. Well, they marched 5 miles, and at noon they went into camp around Marsh Creek. There is no race. There is no rush. They don't know there's going to be a battle the next day. So they just go into camp. We should mention that it's June 30th, and it's the date that the bi-monthly payroll has to be done. And every soldier has to be accounted for and mustered in so that they can be, present on the muster rolls to get paid. They get paid every 60 days. And so there's a lot of paperwork that needs to be done, even when the Army's marching on June 30th. But they go into camp, and General Reynolds makes his headquarters in southern Adams County and makes preparations for the coming events. And when you read about General Reynolds, and here's what I would suggest, go to Edwin Connington and read Edwin Connington's analysis of Reynolds' activities on June 30th. He does the best job of explaining what's going on. There's a lot of books that do a very poor job of explaining the situation. But basically, the Iron Brigade or Wadsworth's division marches to Marsh Creek and camps on either side of Marsh Creek, not far from Boyd's Bears country. What's it going to be called now? Do we know the name of it yet? Oh, it's where General Pickett's, all you can eat buffet is going to be. But again, that's going to have another name too. But there's an article in the paper today about a campground there. But they camp around Marsh Creek, and Hall's battery of Wadsworth, with the Wadsworth division, actually is planted in battery on top of the hill overlooking the road crossing and the bridge. They throw a skirmish line forward out towards Greenmount. And I think it's the 19th Indiana, I believe, off the top of my head, that's on the skirmish line. And just behind the skirmish line is the Riddlemoser farm. And there's a great account where Lieutenant Colonel Dudley of the 19th Indiana and Lieutenant Colonel Callis of the 7th Wisconsin are having a bonfire in front of the Riddlemoser farm, and Henry Riddlemoser is playing the fiddle, and his girls are dancing. They just had, of course, both of them were wounded in the battle the next day, so they reminisce about this event there with the Riddlemoser girls. I think they say tripping the light fantastic. So that brigade goes in the line of battle, or that division, Wadsworth. Now, Robinson's division only marches a few miles and goes into camp just on the other side of the line. Basically, we're talking about Mountain Liquors is right there. Emmitsburg's right here. And they're just up the road and to the right, they go into camp. Basically, the camp is between Middle Creek and Marsh Creek. And Doubleday's division actually camps partially in a line of battle, and they're along this Bullfrog Road. And basically, General Reynolds, not only has he received messages when he was in Emmitsburg about the Confederate whereabouts, and talked to Joseph Copeland's force of Michigan Cavalry, but also General Buford came over the mountains from Fountaindale into Emmitsburg and rode up to Emmitsburg Road, and according to Reynolds' staff, stopped at Reynolds' headquarters, and Buford walks in and talks to Reynolds. Now, this is not in a lot of books, and you know why? Because there's no message. There's no correspondence in the correspondence. Because they're not writing messages to each other, they're talking personally to each other. Have you thought about that when you read about the battle? That we're missing a lot of stuff when people just talk to each other? Because we are looking at the written record of what was going on between the commanders. So Reynolds and Buford talk, and then Beaufort Arrives to Gettysburg. But General Reynolds places his headquarters here at a place called Mertz Tavern. M-O-R-I-T-Z, Mertz. Yeah, that's like, one of those Adams County pronunciations. But the Bullfrog Road leads off the Emmitsburg Road, and it goes directly to Fairfield, Pennsylvania, where we know the Southerners are at. Buford tells him that he was in an encounter with them that morning at Fairfield. And on June 29th and June 30th, Reynolds is totally obsessed with this area and the gaps that the Southern Army could be coming through on his left and rear, and not obsessed with getting to Gettysburg. It's not until the next day that they're really worried about that. Here's a dispatch, just a few words of it, from General Reynolds' headquarters late on June 30th. I think this is to Army headquarters. I think that if the enemy advances in force from Gettysburg and we're able to fight a defensive battle in this vicinity, then the position to be occupied is just north of the town of Emmitsburg, covering the plank road to Taneytown. Have you thought about that? That at Emmitsburg, there's a road that goes directly to Taneytown. And of course, that's where General Meade has a large portion of the army assembling. He will undoubtedly endeavor to turn our left by way of Fairfield and the mountain road leading down into Frederick and Emmitsburg Pike near Mount St. Mary's College. The above is a surmise on my part. So Reynolds is totally obsessed, and he has his men positioned in such a way to be ready to go into defense if the Southerners fall on him from the area of Fairfield or slide into Gettysburg and march down towards him. And that's what he's thinking, not, I need to get to Gettysburg quick so I can meet them in battle. That's not until the next day, and that's another topic because this is called Prelude to Battle. Okay. Well, so, we're always finding new stuff that just amazes us. I was going through boxes of photographs that we had, and I guess this was about 4 years ago, because it's before I started working on the museum full time. And I found this image. And under magnification, I could read some things in advertisements. And I think, I forget what it says, but I was able to figure out this advertisement on the window. And I was trying to figure out where this was. It's a store in this 1880s photograph, but this is the Mertz Tavern. When I finally figured it out, I actually took the photograph down there because the house still stands and lined up the bricks and the doors and the windows and made sure it was the same place. But this was an unidentified, unpublished photograph of Mertz Tavern from around, I'm guessing it's like 1910. So, and this was General Reynolds' headquarters on the night of June 30th, 1863. And of course he met here with his staff, and this is where he had his last meal before riding to Gettysburg. And this is also where General Howard talks about meeting with him. Now, meanwhile in Gettysburg, Lydia Ziegler was the daughter of the guy who was the janitor at the Lutheran Theological Seminary. And she mentioned that night on June 30th, the campfires of the enemy were all along the blue mountainside, only 8 miles distance, while below us we beheld our little town entirely surrounded by thousands of campfires of the Union Army. As we stood on that height and watched the soldiers on the eve of battle, our hearts were made heavy. Many of the soldiers were engaged in letter writing, perhaps writing the last loving missives their hands would ever pen to dear ones at home. In the near distance, we could see a large circle of men engaged in prayer, and as the breezes came up our way, we could hear the petitions which ascended to the Father in heaven. However, many of the boys seemed to be utterly oblivious to the dangers threatening them, and were singing with hearty goodwill the Star-Spangled Banner and many other patriotic songs which we love to hear. We have a bunch of different reactions by the townspeople of the night prior to the battle. As darkness fell, many Gettysburg citizens wondered what the next morning would bring. Dan Skelly would remember well how secure Beaufort's arrival had made the town feel. We thought, surely now we were safe, and the Confederate Army would never reach Gettysburg. Samuel Bushman also had a feeling of security. Although we knew Lee was nearby, we felt that everything was safe. Oh my goodness, yes. Our belongings were under Uncle Sam's protection, and they were all right. All day long, Alice Powers listened to the tramp of the soldier and rested securely that night under their protective care. But other civilians claimed to have full knowledge of the danger that they faced. I think Catherine Foster, Catherine Foster says, now we began to realize the fact of an impending conflict, and our people were full of anxiety, not knowing if they would be safer to remain in town and risk their lives amid the battle, which they knew was about to take place, or seek safety in flight. And you can read a large amount of the accounts of how the different people felt that night. Captain Hazelton, who was in charge of some picket posts along the Chambersburg Pike, not far from where Marcellus Jones would fire the first shot of the battle, mentioned that the farmers in the area came out and fed the men, and it was late at night until they fell asleep. And he said, with the encouragement given to them by the patriotic citizens, they were capable of grander, noble deeds than they had yet performed. In his dreams that night, Hazelton thought of the girls of Gettysburg that day and saw his own sisters waving their handkerchiefs at him. I just think obviously you can pick quotes. Some of these stuff is way over the top, but I love that. Well, I want to thank you for coming to my lecture, and hopefully now that you'll have a better understanding of the events that occurred just in our area. I only did our county just the night before the battle. Do I have any questions?
I'm a historian.
Sure.
This is the first time I had ever heard about Pettigrew coming in.
Oh.
So my logic is this: he knows Beaufort's coming, and Beaufort, of course, is with his horses and coming. Why, if all the Confederate armies, Ewell's here, Lee, all these, why would he retreat?
Well, General Heath, and the same thing for